Today we are messing around. Today you will watch me get carried by Ponpon on a still pretty crazy Freya after today's nerf. And you will also see me missing 90% of my abilities on NA ping on PTS servers, which was really a weird feeling to play, but it's gonna be fun. Because today's build was all about fun. And I will not take credit for this idea either. This build was something that I saw on PTS, played by another player, and I was like, I want to try this, I want to see how this feels. The build in question is Hercules support, but not really that supporty, more like a little bit of support towards the end and generally movement speed Herc. Now, most of you should be familiar with Talaria boots and with the new Bombas mask. This was changed a little bit in this very patch as well. We'll talk about that in a second. But the interesting thing is that you already get a pretty decent percentage increase from that, but Hercules can also make excellent use of Shield of Regrowth because he can literally proc it anywhere. And that in combination makes for some really high movement speed as long as you use your heal, and as you get a decent amount of cooldown reduction along the way, you can use your heal quite often and then you dash as well, and that's exactly what happened. Now let's be real here, can this build actually work in a normal environment, considering that I had not only Ponpon but also Alpha Jackal on my team, and the enemy team had, to be fair, pretty prime, but the rest of the players I don't think were that good. Probably not. While this build is probably not countered by SLOTH, especially because you could still throw in Winged Blade as well, it is decently enough countered by enough hard CC. If you lock down a target with these items once, they will probably take way too much damage. And that is at least partially down to the Bombas mask as well. But Bombas mask got changed a little bit, so this is a little bit more possible than before, given you have enough room for other defense items to make up for it a little bit. Bombas mask is now 2500 gold, it has 20 physical power, 50 magical power, 20% cooldown reduction, plus a 10% damage taken, which makes it very dangerous once CC'd, and minus 10% damage dealt. You also get 35% movement speed. Now we could theoretically actually counter that a little more if we threw in a spirit rope, because that way the moment that you would get CC'd, you would actually take less damage again. The problem is that's not really possible if you're still trying to build some support items for your team, so this is something that would be more likely possible in other game modes, and there it would be very possible. The same build of Talaria, Bombas and Shield of Regrowth and put a Spirit Drop on there and you will be zooming around and not taking all too much damage because you still get health and protection between these items as well. Just like I said, not as suited for Conquest. But outside of the obvious weakness for hard CC, I actually felt like this was interesting in a way that you build a lot of non-typical supporty items, but you still are able to have an impact in terms of setup, and different from normally, you're actually able to get out of bad situations incredibly easily. With the high cooldown reduction, you can also kind of rinse and repeat this over and over. You go in, you try to knock someone towards your team, if it doesn't work out, you just go back out, and if it works out, you possibly set up someone for a kill or for a death rather, and you can always heal up and run away in between, and it's almost impossible for anyone to catch you, because even diminishing returns on the movement speed are not enough to actually stop you. So is this the most viable build I've ever ran? Definitely not. Is this the most fun build I've ever ran? Probably, or at least at the moment. That alone, in my opinion, makes it worth checking out PTS, by the way, so if you don't know about that yet, you can get gems for playing PTS if you play 2 games and win 2 games rather on PTS. During one of the PTS phases, you get 100 gems on your actual Smite live client account. So just throwing that out there in between, just if you want to test this build. Can't guarantee you will win with it. You can see the shenanigans that I'm doing with this build in the background right here, but I would like to use the opportunity of this video to also talk a little bit about the masks in their current state. I will also still do the other videos with Lono's mask and support and all that kind of stuff, don't worry, that's still coming up. But as they would change today, I kind of want to give a bit of an insight in between as to why they were changed and everything. So the goal that Hi-Rez had with the mask from the start was to put guards into roles that they normally don't play. Meaning, for example, you would have a more damage-oriented, more aggressive warrior, solo lane or whatever, doesn't matter, just in a different role maybe as well. You could have, for example, a warrior in jungle better that way, or you would have a more tanky assassin, for example, maybe a Thor with a more tanky build, to kind of, you know, give the game a little bit more flavor in terms of unusual roles and play styles. Initially, that didn't work out at all. And why? Because if an item boosts a character's damage so much that they can fit into a damaging role, then how much more damage boost does an already damaging character get out of that? As such, Rangda's mask was mostly seen on assassins or on mages or on hunters, because they get a massive damage spike out of it. Likewise, most supports were building Lono's mask, as it has that damage reduction, which is really beneficial too. The only one that kinda was somewhere in between was Bamba's mask, was built primarily on junglers, but I pretty much saw it anywhere on the map as well, on more slow characters, utilizing it in other purposes and all that kind of stuff. That one is just a bit more of an all-rounder, also because it has cooldown reduction. As such, the masks obviously didn't really fulfill their intended purpose. And that was changed now by adding restrictions to the masks. Lono's mask can now only be built by mages, hunters and assassins, while Rangda's mask can only be built by warriors or guardians. Likewise, the tier 2 items of the same branch obviously can also only be built by those classes. The only one that is still available to everyone is Bamba's mask. Lono's mask only received one change this patch, and that's to the price. The item is now 2,500 gold instead of 2,200. It still has 100 health, 50 magical and physical protection, 20% CCR, minus 25% damage dealt, and plus 15% damage mitigation, or minus 15% damage taken. Most of the big mitigation guards in the game are therefore out. You could, for example, previously build it on Bacchus, which I have a game of footage of still. You could build it on Kuzenbo, you could build it on Osiris, and all these guards had different ways of negating a lot of the damage that you would otherwise take. And that's pretty cool. There are still a few that can kind of do that, but usually for a much shorter duration. You, for example, have Samdi with his ultimate or Chernobyl with his ultimate, but typically assassins, hunters or mages don't have long phases of damage mitigation that they could utilize in this way. So now it's really more of something that switches classes over. The item was definitely not bad because supports clearly build it. The question for me is if the price isn't maybe a little bit too high now. If you choose to actually go into a more supporty role as a class that is typically not that supporty, then you will still have to build your typical aura items and similar things. Or in solo you will still have to counter build the enemy directly with defense and probably have some CDR or something. And as such, fitting in a 2,500 gold item seems like quite the task. I wouldn't say it's impossible or that the item is bad because of it, but it's something that needs to be figured out properly, and especially with CCR being on that item, it's also not the best overall. The CCR is a good stat, but not the greatest stat you can get. Rangda's mask, on the other hand, took quite the hit, and I'm glad that it did because it was just very frustrating. It got a little bit of a buff, it's now 2,500 gold instead of 2,600, but everything else are nerfs. It now has 15 penetration instead of 20, it has 35 physical power instead of 50, it has 70 magical power instead of 100, and it also now has plus 25% damage taken. It also comes with plus 15% ability damage and plus 20% basic attack damage still. As it was bugged previously, the damage output will also feel less than before anyways, so overall this is some heavy hits to the item. I am not even entirely sure if I would build this item if I was playing a god in an unconventional role. Because if I was looking for example, more damage on a warrior, then I would probably opt more into cooldown reduction, into maybe a mystical mail, into some sort of protection reduction, than just opting for straight power, because that doesn't scale too well for most gods at least. Exception exists, think for example Sylvanas. And you generally really don't get that much extra for the price. I won't say it's a bad item, I don't think so, and I need to test it more anyways before I make an absolute verdict on it. But I do think that it kind of had this vibe of being super strong before, and it might now be a little bit overrated when you actually look at the raw stats and they're not completely overwhelming compared to just building another damaging item instead. I would, for example, think that Spear of Desolation would probably output a little less damage, but would have other benefits that could make it the better choice in many situations overall, as you, for example, don't take 25% extra damage when you're a Guardian. Now, we already talked about Bamba's Mask's new stats, but just to quickly clarify this as well, this item is 100 gold more expensive, it loses 5 physical power and 10 magical power, and the movement speed stat is also more streamlined. Before it was 20% movement speed and plus 50 movement speed. Now it's just plus 35%. Depending on the character, that may be more or less, I'm not quite sure. I think this depends on the base movement speed, but it is just a lot more logical the way it is now. It just sounds a lot clearer to most players anyways. Bamba's Mask still has pretty good stats overall, especially now that you don't take so much more damage from it. I think it's interesting the way it works in that it reduces your own damage now, but I could imagine it still working decently for guards with high base damage values, or guards that make a lot of use of movement speed, or guards that benefit from cooldown reduction and movement speed. Depending on that, it can really range from either being useless to OP, which is kind of funny because that means it really has to find its niche first and people have to figure out how to work with it. But I think in certain situations it will still be too strong, simply because enemies will be too fast at doing what they are not supposed to do that fast, while others it might be weak. I will also have to check more stats in that context for specific guards to check the interactions with these items. And with that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this on one hand gave you an entertaining match to watch, and on the other hand was maybe interesting and insightful too. If you're new to the channel, please sub button with the bell, it really helps me out. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth out.